The silent compassion of Jesus. The dawn broke over Galilee, a slow bleed of rose and gold that painted the underside of the clouds. On the shore, where the gentle lapping of the sea was the only sound, a lone figure stood. His back was to the sleeping towns, his face to the water and the nascent light. The cool, pre-dawn air stirred the hem of his simple woolen tunic, and a stillness surrounded him, a pool of quiet in a world yet to awaken. He stood for a long time, hands clasped loosely, his gaze distant, as if in silent communion with the rhythm of the waves and the expanding light of the sky. This was his sanctuary, these moments before the press of the world began. As the sun climbed higher, casting a diamond-like glitter across the water, the stillness was broken. First came the fishermen, their sinewy arms pulling nets from the deep, their calls to one another echoing over the water. Then, from the direction of Capernaum, the first trickles of people appeared. A few women carrying jars, a pair of old men leaning on staffs, a handful of curious children. They saw the figure on the shore and their pace changed. Hesitation gave way to purpose. The trickle became a stream, the stream a river of human need, flowing towards the silent man by the sea. He turned to face them, and the contemplative solitude in his eyes was replaced by a deep and luminous compassion. There was no weariness in his expression, only a profound welcome. The crowd parted, creating a path for a man being led by a young boy. The man's eyes were milky, sightless voids that stared at nothing. His hands, gnarled and calloused, were held out before him, trembling slightly, grasping at the empty air. He stumbled on the uneven ground, his bare feet caked with the dust of the road he had traveled in darkness. The boy guided him until he stood just a few feet away from the teacher. The man fell to his knees, his head bowed, his unheard plea radiating from his entire being. Jesus knelt before him, the dust soiling the knees of his own tunic. He didn't speak. He simply met the man's unseeing gaze. With his fingers, he gathered a small bit of earth, moistened it, and gently, with a touch that was both firm and infinitely tender, he anointed the blind eyes. The man flinched at the unexpected contact, a tremor of fear and hope running through him. Jesus then pointed toward the sea. The man understood. Guided by the boy, he waded into the cool water, cupping it in his hands and washing the mud from his face. He blinked once, twice. A gasp escaped his lips, a raw, incredulous sound. He looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. He looked at the boy, and tears streamed from his newly opened eyes, mixing with the water of the sea. He looked back at the shore, at the face of the man who still knelt in the dust, and a joy so pure and overwhelming it was almost painful lit his features. The world, once a prison of sound and touch, was now an explosion of color and light. As the healed man wept in the shallows, a commotion was felt in the heart of the crowd. A woman, shrouded in gray, her face pale and drawn with years of sickness and shame, pushed her way forward. She kept her head down, avoiding the scornful glances and muttered condemnations of those who knew her, knew of her unending issue of blood that rendered her unclean. They shrank away from her, creating a moving circle of isolation around her. Her eyes were fixed on one thing only, the hem of the teacher's garment. To her, it was a lifeline. Her fingers, thin and trembling, stretched out. She didn't dare to ask, to speak. to draw his attention. She only wanted to touch, to steal a blessing in secret. She lunged forward, her fingertips brushing the coarse, dusty wool. A current, like a bolt of lightning and a wave of warmth, shot through her. It started in her fingers and flooded her entire body, a sensation of profound and instantaneous wholeness. The chronic ache, the weakness that had been her constant companion for 12 years, vanished. She felt a strength return to her limbs she had forgotten was possible. At the same moment, Jesus stopped. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, not with accusation, but with a quiet, knowing inquiry. The crowd murmured, confused, but the woman knew. She was seen. Her secret act was known. Terrified, she fell at his feet, her body shaking, her face pressed to the ground. He reached down, not to admonish, but to help her up. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and the look in his eyes held no judgment, only an affirmation of her faith, a restoration of her dignity. For the first time in over a decade, she stood tall, not as an outcast, but as a whole person, healed in body and spirit under the full light of the sun. The day wore on. He taught on a small hillside overlooking the sea, his gestures and expressions conveying parables of seeds, of pearls, of lost sheep. He spoke no words, yet the crowd understood. They saw the farmer in the sweep of his arm, the shepherd in the concern on his brow, the father in the welcome of his open hands. The sun beat down, and as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, a new need became apparent. It was a simple, primal need: hunger. The thousands who had gathered were far from any town. The disciples, their faces etched with anxiety, conferred amongst themselves. They approached Jesus, gesturing to the vast multitude and then showing him their empty hands. One of them, Andrew, presented a boy who clutched a small basket containing 5 barley loaves and 2 small salted fish. A meal for one, a mockery for thousands. Jesus took the small offering. He looked at the meager meal, then at the sea of expectant faces covering the hillside. He held the bread and fish up, his face tilted towards the sky. His lips moved in a silent blessing. Then he broke the first loaf. He handed the pieces to his disciples. He broke the second and the third, and he kept breaking. The disciples, their initial worry replaced by wide-eyed disbelief, began to move through the crowd. They filled their own baskets from his seemingly inexhaustible supply. The more they took, the more there was to give. The crisp sound of breaking bread became a constant rhythm. The smell of fresh bread and cooked fish filled the air. Families clustered together, sharing the food, their hunger sated. Children laughed, their mouths full. The disciples moved back and forth, their baskets, once a symbol of their lack, now overflowing with abundance. When every single person had eaten their fill, Jesus had them gather the remaining fragments. 12 baskets were filled to the brim, a tangible testament to the miracle that had just unfolded. The quiet act of breaking bread had become a feast of impossible plenty. As twilight began to purple the sky, he sought solitude once more. He dismissed the satiated and awestruck crowd, urging his disciples into a boat to cross to the other side of the sea. He then ascended a nearby mountain, the rocks rough beneath his sandals. As darkness fell, he knelt among the silent stones, his form a silhouette against a sky now bursting with stars. He was replenishing his spirit, drawing strength from the deep well of his communion with the Father. Below, on the water, the idyllic evening had turned treacherous. A wind swept down from the hills, whipping the sea into a frenzy. The disciples' boat was tossed violently, waves crashing over the sides, threatening to swamp it. These were experienced fishermen, but this storm was different, possessed of a malevolent fury. They fought with the oars, their muscles straining, their faces slick with spray and fear. The shore was lost in the blackness, and they were alone in the raging heart of the sea. In the fourth watch of the night, when exhaustion and despair had set in, they saw it. A figure walking toward them on the crests of the angry waves, as if they were solid ground. A collective cry of terror rose from the boat. They thought it a ghost, an apparition of the sea. But the figure raised a hand, a gesture of peace that cut through the howling wind. As he drew closer, they recognized him. It was Jesus. Peter, ever impulsive, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of desperate faith, called out, his voice unheard but his intention clear. He pointed to himself, then to the water. Jesus nodded. Peter swung a leg over the side of the boat, his eyes locked on his master. For a moment, he stood. He took a step, and the churning water held him. He took another. He was walking on the sea. A grin of pure astonishment spread across his face, but then he looked down. He saw the black, boiling depths beneath his feet. He heard the roar of the wind. Doubt, cold and swift, pierced his heart. He began to sink. The water, a moment ago a solid path, now became a liquid grave, pulling him down. His arms shot up, his hand grasping for help. Before he was fully submerged, a strong hand gripped his. Jesus pulled him up from the churning water, his expression not of disappointment, but of gentle understanding. Together they climbed back into the boat. The instant his feet touched the deck, the wind ceased. The waves subsided. A profound, unnatural calm descended upon the sea. The disciples, drenched and shivering, stared at him, their fear now transformed into an awe that bordered on worship. They had seen him heal the sick and feed the hungry, but this was different. This was power over the very elements of creation. They reached the shore at Gennesaret as the first hints of another dawn were appearing. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Word spread like wildfire through the region. Before they had even finished securing the boat, people were coming from all directions. The sick, the lame, the tormented. They didn't even ask for a grand miracle. They simply reached out, desperate to touch the edge of his clothing, the same way the woman had done. And as their fingers brushed the fabric, they too felt that jolt, that wave of warmth, that instantaneous restoration. He stood among them, on the edge of a new day, the rising sun at his back. His face was weary from the long day and night, yet his eyes still held that endless well of compassion. He moved from person to person, his touch a comfort, his presence a balm. The day was just beginning, and the river of human need was already flowing toward him once more. And he stood ready to meet it, a silent beacon of hope on the shores of the Galilean Sea. The new day at Gennesaret was not born in quiet solitude, but in the full-throated cry of human need. The shore, which only a day before had been his sanctuary, was now a sprawling infirmary under the open sky. He stood not as a solitary figure against the dawn, but as the calm center of a swirling vortex of hope. Hands, frail and desperate, reached for him from every direction. The hem of his garment was a constantly moving target, a focal point for the faith of an entire region. A lame man, his legs twisted since birth, crawled through the dust and touched the fringe of the tunic. A shudder ran through his frame, and with a bewildered cry, he pushed himself up, standing unsteadily for the first time in his life. A woman with a fevered child pushed through the throng, her face a mask of terror. She laid the boy's burning hand against his cloak and watched as the flush receded from her son's cheeks and his breathing eased into the gentle rhythm of sleep. Each touch was a story, each healing a silent testament. But not all who came were seeking wholeness. A new group arrived, their approach sharp and deliberate, parting the crowd not with need, but with an air of cold authority. These were men from Jerusalem, scholars of the law, their robes finer, their beards meticulously groomed, their faces etched with judgmental certainty. They did not look at Jesus with hope, but with scrutiny. Their eyes missed the healings, fixing instead on his disciples who were breaking off pieces of bread for their morning meal without the ceremonial washing of hands. One of the newcomers pointed a finger, his expression one of theatrical disgust. He looked from the disciples' dusty hands to Jesus, his brows raised in a silent, pointed accusation. Jesus observed their rigid disapproval. He did not answer with an argument. Instead, he drew a small, clay drinking cup from a nearby sack. It was dusty on the outside, stained with the grime of the road. He held it up for the men from Jerusalem to see. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he poured clean water into it, filling it to the brim. He offered the cup, gesturing to the clean water within, then to the dusty exterior. He then touched his own chest, over his heart, and then swept his hand outwards from his mouth. The meaning was clear, a parable in gesture. What comes from within a person is what truly defines them, not the ritual cleanliness of their hands. The scholars stared, their lips tightening. They had come for a legal debate and were met with a silent, profound truth that left no room for argument. Frustrated, they turned and departed, their robes swirling in the dust, their certainties shaken. Leaving the restless crowds behind, he set a new course, walking north, away from the familiar sea. The landscape changed, the green hills of Galilee giving way to the drier, foreign lands of Tyre and Sidon. Here, the faces were different, the language a foreign tongue, the air itself seeming to hold a different spirit. It was here that a woman began to follow them. She was not a Jew, her dress and features marking her as a local, a Canaanite. Her hair was unbound, her movements frantic with a grief that transcended language. She trailed them relentlessly, her desperation a palpable force. At times, she would run ahead and prostrate herself in the dusty road before him, her forehead pressed to the earth, her hands gripping his ankles. Her silent plea was for her daughter, a fact conveyed through gestures of a mind in torment, a body thrashing against an unseen enemy. At first, he continued walking, his gaze fixed ahead, a curtain of seeming indifference drawn over his features. The disciples, agitated by her persistence and the scene she was causing, made motions to send her away. But she would not be deterred. As they passed a house where a family was eating, she saw her opportunity. She pointed to the family's dog, snatching up the crumbs that fell from their table. She then fell before Jesus again, pointing from the dog to herself, her expression a mixture of utter humility and ferocious hope. Even the dogs are fed from the master's excess. A change occurred in his eyes. The remoteness dissolved, replaced by a look of profound admiration for the sheer, unyielding power of her faith. He stopped, looked directly at her, and gave a single decisive nod. A gesture of release. Go. It is done. A wave of relief so powerful it buckled her knees washed over the woman. The frantic energy left her, replaced by a serene certainty. She bowed her head one last time in gratitude, then turned and ran, her feet light with joy, back towards her home, her daughter, and her own private miracle. He journeyed on, turning back east, circling toward the region of the 10 towns, the Decapolis. Here, another crowd brought him a man locked in a world of silence. He was deaf, and his tongue was bound, his attempts at speech emerging as guttural, frustrated sounds. He looked at the world with intelligent, trapped eyes. Seeing the clamor of the crowd, Jesus took the man by the hand and led him away from the others, seeking a place of quiet intimacy. Alone with the man, he looked into his eyes, a silent communication of intent and compassion. He gently placed his fingers into the man's ears, a physical act of unstopping them. He then touched his own saliva to the man's tongue, a tangible symbol of loosening its bonds. Finally, he looked up to the heavens, his whole being suffused with a deep, sorrowful sigh, a groan that seemed to carry the weight of all human brokenness. He looked back at the man, his eyes now commanding a single unspoken word: "Ephatha, be opened." The man's eyes widened. A tremor ran through him. For the first time, he heard the sound of the wind in the sparse trees, the distant bleating of a sheep. A sound escaped his own lips, not a groan, but a clear vowel. He touched his throat, astonished. He tried again, forming a word, then another. His voice, crisp and clear, echoed in the quiet space. He looked at Jesus, his face a canvas of pure, unadulterated awe, tears of gratitude streaming down his cheeks. He was no longer a prisoner in his own mind. The world had rushed in, and he could now answer it in kind. This act of compassion drew another vast crowd in that remote, semi-Gentile land. For 3 days they stayed with him, forgetting hunger, forgetting time, held captive by the quiet authority of his presence. Once again, the disciples' faces grew worried. They approached him, gesturing to the thousands of people and their now empty food satchels. This time, they had 7 loaves and a few small fish. It was a familiar problem, but their expressions showed they had not fully learned the lesson. He took the meager offering, his actions a patient repetition of a divine truth. He looked to heaven, gave the silent blessing, and began to break the bread. Once again, the miracle of abundance unfolded. His disciples, their memories sparked, moved through the diverse crowd, their baskets perpetually full. When all had eaten their fill, 7 large baskets of broken pieces were collected. The lesson was retaught, the compassion shown to be boundless, not limited by geography or creed. From there, he sought a place of true solitude, not for himself, but for his closest followers. He led them on a long journey north to the region of Caesarea Philippi, a place dominated by a massive rock formation, the site of pagan temples dedicated to Pan and Caesar. In the shadow of this great rock, a symbol of earthly power and false worship, he stopped. He looked at his disciples, their faces questioning. He pointed to the unyielding stone of the cliff face. Then he turned his gaze to Simon, his most impulsive, flawed, and fervent follower. He placed a hand on Simon's shoulder and then, with his other hand, gestured from the disciple to the great rock and back again. He then made a motion with his hands as if laying a foundation, building something vast and enduring upon that human bedrock. Peter's face showed a flicker of incomprehension, then a dawning, awesome realization of the trust being placed in him. A few days later, he took Peter, James, and John and led them up a high mountain, far from any living soul. The climb was arduous, leaving them breathless. At the summit, as the sun began to set, he began to pray. As he did, a change came over him. It was not a subtle shift, but a stunning metamorphosis. His simple, homespun garments began to glow, radiating a light so pure and intense it was like woven lightning, whiter than any bleach on earth could make it. His face shone with the brilliance of the sun, too bright to look upon directly. The disciples fell back, shielding their eyes, their hearts pounding with a holy terror. Then they were not alone. Two other figures appeared, conversing with him in the incandescent light. One held stone tablets, the other wore the mantle of a great prophet. The ancient law and the prophets stood beside their fulfillment. Peter, overwhelmed and babbling, gestured to make 3 shelters, a nonsensical attempt to contain an uncontainable moment. Before he could finish, a cloud descended upon them, not a rain cloud, but one of luminous vapor, and from its depths a presence was felt, an overwhelming sense of majesty that pressed the disciples flat to the ground, their faces buried in the dirt, trembling. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The light subsided, the cloud lifted. A hand touched Peter's shoulder, firm and familiar. He and the others looked up. Jesus stood before them, alone once more, his clothes dusty, his face that of their teacher. The brilliant light was gone, but a new light lingered in their minds. They had seen beyond the veil. They began the long descent from the mountain in profound, altered silence, the world below seeming both the same and irrevocably different. They were walking back into the valley of human need, but they now carried the memory of the peak, a glimpse of the glory that underpinned every act of silent compassion. They descended from the mountain, from the blinding glimpse of heaven, back into the fractured world of men. At the base, a scene of chaos awaited them. The remaining disciples stood helpless before a man and his young son. The boy was contorted on the ground, his body seized by a violent, unseen force. His eyes rolled back in his head. A crowd had gathered, a circle of morbid curiosity and fear. The father, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and frantic worry, saw Jesus approach and threw himself to the ground, his silent appeal a scream of desperation. He pointed to his tormented son, then to the anxious and ashamed disciples, shaking his head in a gesture of their failure. Jesus' gaze took in the scene, his expression one of deep, weary sorrow, not of anger, but of a profound ache for a world so broken, a faith so frail. He walked to the boy, whose body was now racked with convulsions. He knelt, and with an authority that seemed to quiet the very air, he reached out a hand. He did not touch the boy, but held his hand over him, his eyes filled with a commanding power. The violent thrashing ceased. A final, shuddering breath escaped the boy's lips, and he lay still, as if dead. Murmurs of horror rippled through the crowd. But Jesus took the boy's limp hand, his touch gentle, and pulled him to his feet. Color returned to the child's face. He looked at his father, his eyes clear and calm, the storm within him finally gone. The father enveloped his son in a desperate embrace, his weeping body shaking with a relief so total it was its own form of pain. Jesus watched them for a moment before turning to his disciples, his look a quiet lesson on the power that comes not from proximity, but from unwavering faith. With this, the season in Galilee was over. He turned his face south, towards the heart of Judea, towards Jerusalem. The journey was different now. The pace was more deliberate, the mood more somber. There were fewer grand public miracles and more quiet moments of instruction with his followers. Often, as they walked, they would see him fall silent, his gaze distant, a shadow of future sorrow passing over his features. He would touch his hands, his side, his brow, as if feeling a pain not yet present. The disciples would watch him, their conversations ceasing, a growing unease settling among them. They understood he was speaking of a coming ordeal, but their minds refused to grasp it. Their fear manifested as foolish ambition. In the evenings, as he rested apart from them, they would huddle together, their gestures animated, their glances competitive. They argued in hushed but intense tones, pointing to themselves, puffing out their chests, debating their own importance in the coming kingdom they still envisioned. Jesus observed their silent squabbles. One afternoon, in a small village, he saw a group of children playing a simple game with stones in the dust, their laughter unburdened by ego. He beckoned to one, a small girl with tangled hair and wide, curious eyes. She came hesitantly. He knelt and drew her into the circle of his followers, placing her in their very midst. He put an arm around her small shoulders and looked pointedly at the faces of Peter, James, and John, his expression conveying a truth more powerful than any lecture. To be great was to be like this child, humble, unassuming, and without a thought for status. The disciples fell silent, the heat of their arguments cooled by the clear, simple innocence of the child before them. Their path took them to the border of Samaria, a land of hostile cousins in faith. As they sought passage through a village, they were met not with welcome, but with stony glares. Doors were barred, shutters were closed. The people turned their backs, their rejection a palpable wall. James and John, their faces flushed with indignation, stepped forward. They looked at their master, then glared at the sky, their hands clenched, as if ready to call down fire from heaven to consume the inhospitable town. Jesus turned to them, not with agreement, but with a sharp, sorrowful shake of his head. He gave a final, mournful look at the closed-off village, then turned his back and led his followers away onto a longer, harder road. The lesson was clear. His mission was not one of retribution, but of relentless, even rejected mercy. Further along that road, on the frontier between Samaria and Galilee, a heartbreaking cry reached them. From a safe distance stood 10 figures, their forms indistinct under heavy shrouds, their bodies ravaged by leprosy. They were outcasts, a small colony of the dying. They raised their hands, a desperate plea for a miracle they had only heard about. He stopped and looked at them, his compassion bridging the gulf of their uncleanness. He did not walk to them to touch them. He simply raised his hand and pointed in the direction of the city, a silent command for them to go and present themselves to the priests, as the law required for the clean. They hesitated for a moment. Then, trusting the authority in his posture, they turned and began to walk. And as they walked, the miracle unfolded. One looked at his hands and saw the lesions fading, the skin becoming smooth and whole. Another felt a strength return to his numb feet. Cries of disbelief and ecstatic joy erupted among them. They broke into a run, a stampede of the newly whole, racing towards their new lives. All but one. One of them, seeing his flesh restored, stopped in his tracks. He turned and ran back, his feet flying over the ground. He reached Jesus and fell to the earth, not asking for anything, but pouring out a torrent of silent, tearful gratitude, his head bowed to the dust. He was a Samaritan. Jesus looked down at the grateful man, then his gaze traveled up the empty road where the other 9 had vanished. A profound sadness touched his eyes, a sorrow for the 9 who had received the gift but had forgotten the giver. Finally, they crossed into the sun-baked hills of Judea. Here, a young man of great wealth and stature approached him. His robes were fine, his bearing noble, and his eyes held a genuine, searching hunger. He knelt before Jesus, his posture radiating a single urgent question: what must he do to inherit eternal life? Jesus looked at him, and a visible wave of love and affection passed over his face. He held up his hand, ticking off the commandments on his fingers. Do not murder. Do not steal. Honor your parents. To each, the young man nodded eagerly, his expression earnest. He had done all this. A final challenge remained. Jesus looked at the young man's rich clothing, at the heavy purse at his belt. He then gestured to a group of beggars huddled by the roadside, their faces thin with hunger. Finally, he pointed down the dusty path he himself was walking, an open invitation to follow. The light in the young man's face died. His confident posture collapsed. He looked at his hands, at the wealth that had always defined him. He looked at the poor, at the hard road ahead, and at the teacher who offered a treasure that could not be held. A terrible, visible war raged within him. With a final look of profound regret, he stood up and turned away, his shoulders slumped. His wealth, once his glory, was now a crushing weight, dragging him back to a life he suddenly knew was empty. Jesus watched him go, his heart breaking for the man he loved, the man who had made the great refusal. His disciples, who had watched the exchange, were visibly shaken. If a man so good could not enter the kingdom, what hope was there for them? Seeing their fear, Jesus picked up a piece of discarded rope from a camel's pack and a large sewing needle. He held up the thick, coarse rope and tried to force it through the needle's tiny eye, a clear demonstration of an impossibility. This, his gesture said, is how hard it is for the wealthy to release their grip on the world. The disciples' faces fell even further. But then, he dropped the rope and needle and looked up to heaven, his expression shifting to one of absolute trust and peace. His gaze returned to them, serene and reassuring. With man, it is impossible. With God, all things are possible. They resumed their journey, the final stage before Jerusalem. They were on the road to Jericho, a path that descended into the arid Jordan Valley. The sun was relentless, the landscape harsh and unforgiving. Jesus walked ahead of them all, his pace unwavering, his face set like flint towards the city that awaited him. The disciples followed, a small, huddled group in his wake, their hearts a turbulent sea of awe, confusion, and a gathering, unspoken dread. The final confrontation was near. The road to Jerusalem was a river of people, a pilgrimage of the hopeful and the curious, and he was the stone that parted the current. As they neared the ancient city of Jericho, a persistent cry cut through the din of the crowd. It came from a blind beggar sitting by the roadside, a man named Bartimaeus, whose world was a tapestry of sounds, and whose only possession was the cloak he sat upon. The crowd, annoyed by the disruption, tried to silence him with sharp gestures and angry hisses, but the man's desperate, unheard calls only grew louder. Jesus stopped. The entire procession, a sea of hundreds, came to a halt for this one man. He beckoned, and the beggar was brought before him. Jesus looked at him, his gaze a question that needed no words. The man pointed to his own sightless eyes, his entire being a plea for light. A quiet power emanated from Jesus, a silent command of restoration. The beggar's eyes, clouded for a lifetime, suddenly cleared. He blinked, a gasp of pure shock tearing from his throat. He saw the face of the man before him, the dust on the road, the colors of the sky. In a single explosive motion of gratitude, he threw off his beggar's cloak, casting aside his old identity, and joined the crowd following the source of his new world. The final approach to Jerusalem was not as a humble teacher, but as a king, though of a kind the world had never seen. He rode not a war horse, but a young donkey, a symbol of peace, yet the fervor was that for a conqueror. The road was carpeted with cloaks, a gesture of supreme honor. The air was thick with the green scent of freshly cut palm branches, waved by a jubilant crowd. Their mouths formed unheard shouts of Hosanna, their faces alight with messianic expectation. But as he crested the Mount of Olives and the magnificent panorama of Jerusalem, its golden temple gleaming in the sun, spread before him, his face was not one of triumph. A deep, profound sorrow filled his eyes, and tears traced paths through the dust on his cheeks. He wept not for his own fate, but for the beloved, beautiful city that was blind to the path of peace, deaf to the call of its own salvation.
He entered the city and went to the temple. The outer court, meant to be a place of prayer for all nations, was a cacophony of commerce. The air was filled with the bleating of sacrificial animals, the clinking of coins being exchanged at exorbitant rates, and the crude shouts of merchants. It was a marketplace, not a house of prayer. A holy fire ignited in his eyes. He bent down, his hands gathered discarded pieces of rope and leather, braiding them into a whip. It was not an act of random anger, but a focused, righteous purpose. He moved through the court like a storm. Tables were overturned, coins scattering across the stone pavement with a sound like metallic rain. He flung open the cages of doves, their wings beating a sudden, panicked path to freedom. He drove the bewildered sheep and oxen out, his presence an undeniable force of authority. The money changers and priests stared, their faces a mixture of stunned disbelief and rising fury. In a few moments of decisive, silent action, he had cleansed the sacred space, his blazing eyes the only sermon he needed to preach. In the days that followed, the temple court became his classroom, but he was a hunted man. Scribes and Pharisees, their faces hard with legalistic pride, shadowed his every move. They approached him in groups, attempting to trap him with silent, hypothetical questions, gesturing to a Roman coin, then to the temple treasury, pointing to a woman caught in sin, then to the pile of stones used for judgment. But his responses, delivered through a simple parable drawn in the dust, or a look that pierced their self-righteousness, left them speechless and frustrated before the crowds that now hung on his every move. The evening before the end, he was in Bethany in the house of a friend. A woman approached him from behind, holding a sealed alabaster jar. In an act of extravagant love, she broke the neck of the flask and poured its contents, a perfume of pure nard, worth a year's wages, over his head and feet. The room was instantly filled with the overwhelming, beautiful fragrance. Some of his disciples, led by Judas Iscariot, reacted with indignation. Judas gestured furiously from the shattered jar to the door, his expression a mask of feigned concern for the poor who could have benefited from its sale. Jesus silenced them with a raised hand. He looked at the woman with an expression of deep, solemn gratitude. He touched his own head, then his feet, and looked at his disciples. His gaze conveyed the meaning. This was no waste. It was a preparation, an anointing for a burial they could not yet comprehend. Judas saw the look, understood the finality in it, and his face hardened into a dark resolve. He slipped out of the room, the scent of the perfume clinging to him as he walked into the night to make his transaction. In a quiet upper room, he gathered his 12 for a final meal.
The air was thick with his sorrowful intimacy. He rose, tied a towel around his waist, and began to wash their feet, the work of the lowest servant. When he came to Peter, the fisherman recoiled, shaking his head and holding up his hands in protest. Jesus looked at him, a long, meaningful gaze that spoke of a shared destiny, and Peter's resistance crumbled. He thrust both his feet and hands forward, his entire being now desperate for any part of his master. When the washing was done, he took his place with them again. He took a loaf of unleavened bread, his eyes filled with an infinite love, and he looked towards heaven in a silent blessing. He broke it and gave a piece to each of them, his gaze lingering on each face. Then he took a cup of wine, blessed it, and passed it among them. A new covenant was sealed in these simple elements, a promise of a body broken and blood poured out. His eyes met Judas's across the table as the betrayer took the bread. A moment later, Judas rose and vanished into the darkness. Later, under the ancient olive trees of Gethsemane, a terrible agony descended upon him. Taking Peter, James, and John with him, he went deeper into the garden's shadows. He fell to the ground, his body contorted as if under an immense physical weight. His face was pressed to the earth, his silent communion a battle of cosmic proportions. A sweat of pure anguish beaded on his brow, each drop like a tear of blood. He sought the comfort of his friends, only to find them asleep, their bodies heavy with sorrow and exhaustion. He returned to his solitary struggle, his will surrendering to a fate he had long foreseen. The quiet of the garden was shattered by the flicker of torches. Judas appeared, leading a detachment of temple guards. He walked to his master and with a sickening intimacy gave him a kiss. It was the signal. Hands seized him. For a flash, Peter's loyalty erupted into violence, a sword slicing through the air. But Jesus stopped him, and in his last act of freedom, he reached out and touched the wounded servant of his enemy, healing him. He was dragged through a sleepless night of sham trials. From the high priest's court to the Roman governor's praetorium, he was a figure of silent, unyielding dignity in a maelstrom of accusations, mockery, and hatred. They twisted a crown of thorns and pressed it onto his scalp. They draped a soldier's purple cloak over his bleeding back and put a reed in his hand for a scepter. They struck him and spat on him, and through it all, he remained silent. The morning light revealed the road to Golgotha. He carried the heavy wooden crossbeam on his raw and broken shoulders, stumbling through a jeering, merciless crowd. At the place of the skull, they drove the nails through his hands and feet. They raised his cross between two thieves, a king on a throne of agony. Soldiers gambled for his simple tunic at his feet. For hours he hung there, a silhouette against a sky that began to darken unnaturally at midday. He looked down and saw his mother, her face a mask of unspeakable grief, and next to her the disciple John. A flicker of his eyes, a slight inclination of his head, entrusted them to each other's care. As the end neared, his head, heavy with the sins of the world, finally slumped to his chest. A final shuddering breath was released. At that moment, in the temple, the massive veil that screened the holiest place was torn in two, from top to bottom. His followers, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, took his body down from the cross with hurried tenderness. They washed his wounds, wrapped him in clean linen with 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes, and laid him in a new tomb carved from rock. A great stone was rolled across the entrance, sealing the hope of the world in darkness. The third day dawned, gray and still. A small group of women, their faces etched with grief, made their way to the tomb with more spices to anoint the body. As they drew near, a shock ran through them. The massive stone, which had required several men to move, was rolled away. They peered into the gloom of the tomb's interior. It was empty. The linen wrappings lay collapsed, the headcloth neatly folded by itself. Fear and bewildered grief sent them running. Mary Magdalene remained, weeping, alone, in the garden. Through her tears, she saw a figure she assumed was the gardener. He stood before her, and a silent question was in his posture. She gestured to the empty tomb, her shoulders shaking with sobs, pleading for the return of his body. The figure simply turned to face her fully. He did not speak a word, but in the familiar turn of his head, in the deep compassion that radiated from his eyes, in his very presence, recognition struck her like lightning. It was him. The gardener was the Lord. A gasp, a single unspoken name on her lips. Joy, brilliant and impossible, flooded the garden, more radiant than the rising sun. Death was a broken cage. The story was not over. It had just begun.
The garden was the womb of a new creation. Mary Magdalene, her grief shattered by a joy so profound it was almost a new kind of pain, ran from the empty tomb. She found the disciples, a brotherhood of the grieving, hidden behind a locked door, their hope as cold and as sealed as the tomb they believed still held their Lord. Her gestures were frantic, her face alight with an impossible truth, but her story was met with the vacant stares of men who had lost their anchor. That same day, 2 of his followers walked a long, dusty road to a village called Emmaus. Their shoulders were slumped, their feet heavy with the weight of their disillusionment. A stranger joined them, his pace matching theirs, his presence quiet and unobtrusive. They poured out their story to him with gestures of profound sadness, the hopes they had, the leader they had lost, the brutal finality of the cross. The stranger walked with them, and as the miles passed, he began to motion to the ancient scrolls he carried, his fingers tracing passages, his hands shaping a new understanding. He connected the suffering they had witnessed to the prophecies they had known, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth began to kindle in their chests. They reached the village and, unwilling to let this compelling presence go, urged him to share their evening meal. He sat with them. He took the simple, coarse bread. He held it, his face tilted upwards in a familiar, silent blessing. And then he broke it. In that single, characteristic motion, the same motion that had fed thousands on a hillside, the same motion that had sealed a covenant in an upper room. Their eyes were opened. It was him. And in the very instant of their recognition, he vanished from their sight. They were left staring at the broken bread, the warmth in their chests now a blazing fire. They forgot their weariness, forgot the late hour, and ran, their feet flying, all the way back to Jerusalem. They found the others still in the locked room and burst in, their faces telling the story before they could even gesture. As they were confirming Mary's news, he was suddenly there. Not a spirit, not a fading vision, but a solid presence who had bypassed the locked door. He stood among them. A wave of terror washed over the disciples. They shrank back, convinced they were seeing a ghost. But he was calm. He held out his hands, showing them the raw, healed-over wounds of the nails. He pulled aside his tunic to show them the gash in his side. These were not the wounds of a ghost, but the credentials of a resurrected body. To dispel their last shred of disbelieving fear, he gestured for food. They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it before their eyes. Their terror dissolved,
replaced by a stunned, incredulous, and overwhelming joy. One, Thomas, was absent. When he returned, he met their joyful gestures with a grim, stubborn skepticism, shaking his head, his face a mask of doubt. He pointed to his own hands, his own side, his expression clear. Unless he could touch the wounds himself, he would not believe. A week later, they were gathered again, and Thomas with them. Again, Jesus appeared among them. He walked directly to Thomas, his eyes holding no rebuke, only a deep, knowing love. He held out his scarred hands, he gestured to his side, an open invitation to probe the very center of the miracle. Thomas's hand trembled. He reached out, his fingers tracing the impossible wound. The last wall of his doubt crumbled, and he fell to his knees, his face a portrait of complete and utter surrender, his unheard cry the most profound confession of faith. He called them back to the place where it all began, the Sea of Galilee. Peter, perhaps lost in the void of his new reality, had returned to his old life, his boat, his nets. The others had joined him. They toiled all night, their familiar skills failing them. The nets came up empty, time and time again. As dawn painted the sky, a figure stood on the shore, a silhouette against the rising sun. He gestured to them, a simple instruction to cast their net on the other side of the boat. Weary and resigned, they obeyed. The net was instantly filled, a thrashing silver weight of fish so heavy they could not pull it in. John, his heart quicker than the others, gripped Peter's arm and pointed to the figure on the shore. It was him. Peter, in a blaze of his old impulsiveness, forgetting the boat, the fish, his companions, dove into the sea and swam for shore.
When they all arrived, they found a charcoal fire already burning, fish cooking on the embers, and bread waiting. He had prepared breakfast for them. After they had eaten, he walked with Peter alone along the shore. He stopped and looked into the fisherman's eyes, a long, searching gaze that held the memory of the threefold denial in the courtyard. A silent question was asked. Peter, his heart aching, nodded in affirmation, his entire being pleading his loyalty. Jesus gestured to a nearby flock of sheep grazing on the hill. "Feed them." He looked at Peter a second time, the same question, more insistent. Peter's affirmation was stronger, more earnest. Jesus gestured to the sheep again. "Care for them." He looked at Peter a third and final time, a gaze that pierced to the very soul. Peter's face crumpled, the memory of his failure washing over him, but he did not look away. He nodded, his commitment absolute, sealed by his past pain. A look of complete forgiveness and trust dawned on Jesus' face. He placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, then pointed down the shoreline. "Follow." The denial was erased. The shepherd was commissioned. His time was complete. He led them to a mountain, and there he stood before them, not as the weary teacher, but as the Lord of all. He gestured to the heavens above and to the earth beneath, a silent declaration that all authority was his. He then swept his arm wide, encompassing the whole of the world, from the rising of the sun to its setting. His hands made the motions of teaching, of immersing in water, of gathering. It was their commission, their great sending. And then a final promise. He pointed to them, then to himself, then to the distant horizon, a look that pledged his presence with them, always, to the very end of the age. He led them a short way to the slope of the Mount of Olives, the very place from which he had wept over Jerusalem. He raised his hands over their heads, his hands that had healed, blessed, and broken bread,
His face was a luminous portrait of divine love. And as he blessed them, he began to rise. Gently, gracefully, his feet left the earth. He ascended, his hands still extended in that posture of benediction. They watched, their faces a mixture of complete awe, profound sorrow, and a new, unshakable peace. He rose higher until a cloud, a final curtain between the seen and the unseen, enveloped him, and he was gone from their sight.
They stood for a long time, gazing at the empty sky where he had been. Then, slowly, they turned. They walked back to Jerusalem, not with the crushing grief of the crucifixion, nor with the disbelieving shock of the resurrection, but with a new, quiet, and powerful joy. They were no longer just followers, they were witnesses. They were no longer just disciples, they were apostles. The man of silent compassion had finished his work, and now theirs was about to begin.